very happy to have Jeff Colgan from Brown University back here. He is a proud PhD at the Politics Department, but as my colleague reminds me, SPIA. And it's just like last year, he was right up here sitting where you're today. And he's really made a name for himself doing stuff on the international politics of the environment. And this is an interesting talk, really gets at policy issues that we're all facing in the newspaper today. The usual rule that people have not been here before, I will sit here right in the back, like you can see the whole room. If you want to ask a question afterward, get on the list, raise your hand. If you want to have a clarifying question, do so. So welcome back.
Thanks so much.
And 115 is a hard stop.
Great, thank you. I have to tell you a story about the last time I gave a talk. I was then a newly minted assistant professor at American University, and I was feeling pretty good about getting invited to come back to the place where I got my PhD and give a research talk at Princeton. And I went to check in at the NASA Inn, and there was an older gentleman beside me who was also checking in. And when asked for his name, he replied, "Jürgen Habermas." I said, okay, I have been put in my place, and I carry this little dose of humility with me. But I want to put a question on the table for us. The question is, how do energy and international order relate to each other? And this is a recurring question for international relations, often in the wake of wars in the Middle East over the last 50 years or so. But today, in the context of a war in Europe, where Russia invaded Ukraine, and that carries with it energy consequences. And so, in a sense, this paper that I shared with you is an attempt to think through, we've had this major event in the last year. I guess it's now a year and 3 or 4 days old. What does this teach about international relations? I think it should reflect, as scholars of IR, when we get new information about the world, even when of course it is very sad information, we should try to learn from it. So the argument that I'm going to offer focuses on oil and to a certain extent natural gas as well, which is still sort of the beating heart of global energy politics. And the first part of the argument is that we have had, for about 50 years, a story in double vision of oil politics, where we have seen from an IPE perspective, international political economy perspective, of major changes that have occurred over really the last century of oil politics. We have major shifts in governing arrangements. But at the same time, if we examine the security arrangements that underpin global market for oil, we see a relatively high degree of continuity. So very different kind of story depending on how we look at it. And this simultaneous change and continuity in the same issue area is something of a conceptual problem for some of our favorite IR. To do better, I would suggest that we should see international order as made up of subsystems that operate semi-independently of each other. If I made that argument, I would say, well, the Ukraine war is actually bringing back together some of the subsystems that have operated pretty independently of other national subsystems. It's now bringing it back into the fold and interacting more with these other, and that has some really big implications for the war and for international. So I'm going to start with a definition, because there are many, many definitions of international order, thanks to our field's love of proliferating definitions. But I'm going to draw on our colleague John Eichenberry's definition, who sees order as the governing arrangements among the different states, including its fundamental rules. And Mode's theory of international order depend on some notions of, right? This is true of realists like Bob Gilpin or liberal internationalists like Todd Eikenberry, or even constructivist theories from Eagle and Go. And the notion of a hegemon is a little less well defined. We often talk about it as leading state in a hand-wavy type of way, but we see typically a change in order as occurring with a change in hegemony. Often in the wake of a major power war like World War II, where we get a victor from the war, a new state that becomes the hegemon, gets to set the rules of the post-war world. Well, bringing this back to oil, how do we think about the order for oil? And if we want the IPE story, we might think about this kind of one slide, right? What you see in this slide is over the last 150 years or so that oil has been a major commodity. You see the volatility in the price of oil, not the price itself, but the month-to-month change. And for most of that time, oil has been quite volatile. But there was this period in the 20th century, roughly the 1930s to the early 70s, when so-called seven sisters, seven Anglo-American oil companies, operating as a cartel, controlled the price of oil with a remarkably high degree of effect. Not necessarily good, but very effective. Right? So much so that they kept the price of oil to not change by even a penny per barrel for a whole decade in the 90s. Right? That is the kind of control over the global market for oil that OPEC today can only dream of having. Right? But then in the 1970s, those arrangements changed quite dramatically. So what happened? And if you look for, an explanation in an IR textbook, I want to go back to sort of reach for the standard explanation, you are likely to get something like hegemonic stability. And Charles Kindleberger, just prior to these years, had come up with this set of ideas for hegemonic stability theory, and this looked like a kind of textbook illustration where the United States was in relative economic decline compared to where it had been 25 years earlier after World War II, when it was like percent of the world's GDP. That was no longer true in the 1970s. Lo and behold, the U.S. seems to lose control over the market. And this is true not only for hegemonic stability theorists, but also for some of their most prominent intellectual adversaries. So a then young-ish man named Robert Cohen writes a book in the early 80s called After Hegemony, and he looks at three issue areas: oil, trade, and finance. Right? And in trade and finance, he challenges hegemonic stability theory. But for oil, he accepts it as a sort of fully adequate explanation of what happened in this. And this, I think, is where we get into trouble as IR. When we think about what hegemony means, because usually when we talk about hegemony, we're not just talking about the largest economy. We're also thinking about the hegemon as a state that is the most powerful military, that is the most technologically advanced, and has control over flows of key resources or public health. And so there are these kind of multiple dimensions baked in. But if hegemony is one kind of comprehensive idea, then I want you to think about a little thought experiment. Go back to 1975 and ask, what do you think will happen to America's military presence in the Persian Gulf in the years? Right. So now it's 2023. You know the answer. You can cheat on the test if you want, but follow the logic of the theory. Right. If we just imagine that 1973 shows us that hegemonic stability theory is at work here. We have a declining hegemon. Well, then you might say, okay, we know what a declining hegemon might do. We just had one in the British Empire. British Empire ultimately withdrew from the Persian Gulf. And so we might expect something similar in the United States in the years to come. fact, that's not what happened, of course. If anything, the US military has become larger and more active. And so we have this notion of hegemony that is sort of doing multiple things and maybe not in a consistent way. So to do better, I think we could use two concepts. I'm going to focus mostly on one of them, but very briefly, the idea of partial hegemony, which is the title of the book from which this topic is on. And it is the idea, partial hegemony describes a situation in which we have a state that has one or more dimensions of primacy, but not necessarily primacy in every domain. Right? So I think that's useful in an era like the one we're in right now, where we have the United States, arguably still the strongest military power on earth, but is not the most technologically advanced in every area, certainly not the most dominant in manufacturing in all areas, and maybe not even kind of primary in all forms of military power. Okay. Second concept I just want to put on the table, right? And these are, I'm just going to lay them out. Second one is the idea of subsystems. And I define a subsystem as a collection of actors, state and non-state actors, that are orbiting around a single question of governance, a functional question. So we might have multiple subsystems within a given issue. So for instance, I think oil has two primary subsystems. One focuses on the question of how much oil to produce and where to produce. And this core oil production question, which has been a central issue all the way back to the days of John D. Rockefeller. And today we have actors like OPEC and ExxonMobil and Russia and a whole lot of others that are interacting on a day-to-day basis to try to answer that question, sometimes competing, sometimes cooperating, but incredibly important for ultimately the price of oil and therefore by extension the world. And understandably, we sometimes treat that as almost the whole issue area. But that, I think, misses another subsystem, which is sometimes more subterranean, but really important, which is around the question of what countries have political sovereignty over what oil. Right? Or put differently, how are the world's oil fields distributed politically around you? And this matters a lot in terms of the market structure for oil. And we can think of whether the market structure of oil is going to be more monopolistic or more fragmented, depending on who has control of that oil. And this question turns out to be so important that great powers have gone to war over the answer to that question on globalization. So I'm going to talk about that. But more broadly, not just for oil, but in general, I think if we're interested in changes in international order, that's one of our kind of key dependent variables, then we can think about that as occurring at the subsystem level rather than overall. This vision of international order, I think about it having two key components. One is those governing arrangements that John Eikenberry constitute international order. But unlike him, I see them operating at a subsystem. And then the second component is the sort of theme or themes that emerge from the ideational consistency in the governing arrangements across various subsystems. And so then when we talk about the liberal international order, for instance, liberal is the theme, right? And that theme can be kind of an emergent property from those subsystems of the governing arrangement, or to a certain extent, it can be designed, right? The theme can be consciously pursued by policy, and that might vary. So if you're thinking about, okay, how is Jeff's concept of order different from what's happened before, how we normally think about it in IR, I guess I would emphasize the idea that we can have multiple subsystems within a single issue area. And the difference here is that issue areas have always been poorly defined in the sense that we never pinned them down exactly, not only what the borders were, but even what the heart of the issue. And so for a given issue area, you can have both change and continuity in the same one at the same time, which makes an explanatory theory of change in international order a little bit harder to do. Right? It's interesting. Yeah.
Just want to make double sure that I understand what you mean by subsystem. So a subsystem is within an issue area, and it's a dimension of usable bargaining power that could be constituted within higher level. Think of this as hegemony. So, for example, you could have bargaining power by virtue of being able to bargain in and do something. You get bargaining power by virtue of controlling the market. You get bargaining power by virtue of culture or whatever.
Yes. So I wouldn't define it in those terms, but I think that's an implication. Exactly right. That when we think about a subsystem and there's a governing question, you have different types of power or bargaining leverage, whichever terms we want to use, that apply to that subsystem.
So if you're not defining it that way, what is the definition?
The definition is just that it's a collection of actors that orbit around a governing question. And depending on the nature of the governing question, I can see exactly what you're saying, right? The different types of relational power that pertain. But the definition is just kind of the group of actors that orbit around the two questions. Okay. You can see that's not satisfying, but we'll come back now. Okay. So the key empirical claim that I want to make in terms of oil politics in the last 50 years is that while we have remarkable shifts in the IPE part, the production part of oil, we also have considerable continuity in the security side of the story. And this comes out of some very durable incentives that great powers face with regard to oil. And it turns out that access to oil has proven absolutely essential for modern militaries and to a certain extent for economic prosperity as well. This lesson was driven home by World War I and even more so World War II, where access to oil was absolutely critical for all of the key of tanks and planes and ships. They all run on fuels that are derived. So great powers have these incentives to minimize threats to that oil access and capability. The result is that without necessarily any one person designing or intending it this way, there emerged this network of so-called oil for security deals, where you have petrostates as clients and the Anglo-American powers as protectors of those. And so there's an exchange of some economic benefits associated with oil in exchange for these security protection. Now, the details of these arrangements vary by country, by client, and over time. But there's a family resemblance there, and they descended to a certain extent from the imperial system, which in a sense had oil for security deals embedded within the nature of it. By the 1950s, oil for security deals were in place or developing with essentially all of the oil producers, all of the major oil producers in the Persian Gulf to North Africa region that today we call it. And some of these over time broke down. The deals changed. They did so in each case in conjunction with a domestic revolution in the petrostate. So Iraq in 58, Libya in 69, and Gaddafi, and then Iran in 70. But 6 out of the 9, the original 9 countries, continued their oil for security deal, and still in place today. And so we can think of them as forming the kind of incomplete backbone of the and so this is what I mean by a fairly high degree of continuity, because we've got something like an 80+ year relationship in at least some cases, right? So one of the most important, maybe the most important, is the one, of course, between the United States and Saudi Arabia. This is a relationship that got started in the 1930s when the Saudis invited American oil companies to explore for oil. And in fact, one of the reasons they were asked was precisely because they weren't British. Right? The Saudis didn't want the British involved. They wanted sort of a distant partner. The deal basically operates by, on one hand, the U.S. providing protection, military assurances, which is manifested in a number of instances over time, maybe most vividly in 1990 with Operation Desert Shield. And in exchange, the Saudis have offered various sorts of economic benefits. Originally, it was the oil itself, but this becomes a bit of a misnomer to call it oil for security. Today, it is more like some things that are associated with oil, that is requiring payments for oil. There were other types of oil for security arrangements. The one that Iran had was considerably less voluntary, more coercive than the one that the Saudis had. And so, for instance, in 1951, this man here, Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, became prime minister of Iran and nationalized Iran's oil sector, which up until then the British had been running. And this was something that the British didn't like very much. And so you get this striking boycott, right? What the British did was they asked the Seven Sisters to boycott oil worldwide. And it was incredibly effective. And in some ways, there are these parallels between what happened then in 51 and what we're trying to do now in 1953 with Russia. Right? We're trying to sort of shut the Russians out in certain ways. But in 51, we had the Seven Sisters cartel to turn to, and they had a much tighter grip on the market for oil, and so they could really make it so that Iran could produce the oil, but they had nowhere to sell. So that created real economic hardship for Iran for a couple of years until in 1953, the CIA and the British MI6 cooperated to foment a coup against Mossadegh in Iran, returns the Shah to power, and he denationalizes the oil sector and turns it over to guess who? British and the Americans. And so these companies get to continue on in their operation. And so you had at that point still a set of economic relationships that were backed by this quasi-imperial relationship where there's a real threat of material force. That changed, of course, in 1953, and you get this. So I've talked a lot now about concepts and path. I want to turn now to how do we think about this in terms of the Ukraine, and in what ways is energy related to the Ukraine. And so if we think about this idea of subsystems operating semi-independently from each other, we can have changing continuity at the same time, as being quite useful to describe the previous case, then it is striking that those supply systems are now being brought back into great power politics. And so one way of thinking about this is first to start by thinking about the war itself as representing at least two types of overlapping conflicts. And so on one hand, you've got the territorial conflict in Ukraine, but you also have an energy conflict that is layered onto that is quite distinct because it operates at different speeds with different actors, much greater geographic scope, different tools, and different conflicts. And so, for instance, if we think about the energy conflict and its effect geographically, it affects people in Egypt and India and China and Texas in ways that are, for the average person, much more direct and immediate than the kind of distant Ukrainian military. Much less intense, of course, but more, but bigger scope. So how do we think about how these subsystems I would argue that, as I said, the Ukraine war causes less independence for the supply systems of oil and gas and their relationship to others. Okay? So evidence for that. On the one hand, you've got the Russian energy embargo on natural gas sales to Europe. So it's a de facto embargo. It's not full, a partial embargo, but nonetheless a very significant one. And in this case, we've got a shift in governing arrangements where it used to be largely sort of market operation between Russia and Western Europe. And now suddenly we have that market being put in service to Putin's larger geopolitical goals. And to a certain extent, this was something that he was already seeding years ago when he was talking about creating Russia as an energy. He wanted this ability to use energy as a strategic power. And now he's trying to do it. At the same time, you have a second step where the West responds and focuses on the oil markets, where the West is putting a boycott of their own in terms of their purchasing power, but also, more interestingly, trying to put a price cap on Russian sales worldwide, not just the G7 countries that are sponsoring it, but also applying this to India or to other actors in Asia. And this is really sort of quite different from what we've seen other sanctions in the oil markets look like. Right? So we have in the past tried to sanction countries like Libya or Iran, but it's different in two respects. One, the sanctions were always just kind of like a boycott. They were never an attempt to control prices and to put a cap on things. And that has some very specific consequences to it, and it raises real fears. If you're an oil producer, you start to think, well, if the U.S. can do that to their oil, why can't they do it? That's so scary. And second, when we've done sanctions in the past, they were to relatively small actors. Right? Russia is a monster for the global oil market. It is one of the big three oil producers, along with Saudi Arabia and the United States. Those three actors each produce about 10% of oil. And so shutting out Russia is like a sizable there is that change trying to change. So again, this is where the oil subsystem, which has been largely a kind of free market operation, is being put in service to geopolitics and put in what I would argue is sort of the subsystem for territorial sovereignty, specifically as it relates to. Okay. So implications, and here in the paper I talk about sort of 5 different implications. I'm not going to go through all of them now, but I would say that this shift has implications for the causes of the war, for the scope, the duration, the outcome, potential outcome, and even the long-term cost. I won't do them all, but let me just mention one on the side of causes of the war. If we ask the question of how did oil and energy contribute to the cause of the war, first thing I would say, okay, look, there are lots of things that caused the war, and so we should avoid a lot of couples. Right? So we have to think about Ukrainian history and NATO expansion and Putin's motives and all sorts of other things. But I do think that energy mattered, and that it raised the probability of war for a couple of key reasons. One is the argument I would go back to the work that I did at Princeton, actually, that was behind this book, Petro. When we think about Russia, it is almost a classic petro state. Depends on something like 50% of its government revenues for oil. And so those countries, petrostates, tend to engage in more interstate conflict on average than not, by a rate of about 50%. And moreover, they tend to be the instigators of conflict rather than simply the prize. And so why does that happen? Well, I argued in this book that oil's consequence for a petrostate's foreign policy depends on its domestic politics. So it's a conditional effect. But when paired with leaders that have aggressive preferences, then it can raise the probability of war. And not every detail of this argument matches up well, but I think overall, if you think about Putin's Russia, this fits pretty well. That this holds up to, unfortunately, the kind of behavior that Putin is displaying now is consistent with what we've seen with Iraq under Saddam Hussein or Libya under Gaddafi, where a leader gets some oil resources and uses it to either buy off or repress domestic opposition, and that gives him, unfortunately, a very free hand to get into various disadvantages. So that's one way, but there is a second way that is specific to this war, and I think it matters to the causes, which is about Europe's energy dependence. And Russia could anticipate, some sanctions when they're thinking about whether to invade. I think it was reasonable for Russia to expect that Europe would not be too big. There was some real uncertainty about how big those sanctions would be, how unified the West would be, but the expectation of some sanctions. And so there was a reasonable expectation for Russia to think that it had energy coercion as a potential bargaining chip or leverage for the post-battlefield settlement of what happened in Ukraine. And so at the time, Russia was expecting to have some quick and satisfying battlefield outcomes, and therefore might be able to use energy coercion to bring Europe to the table. Now, it turns out that energy coercion has not worked very well, at least from the Russian perspective, and Europe was bailed out in part by a quite mild winter this year. So, yay, climate change, I guess is the one instance that we might say that. But on the other hand, what actually happened is maybe different from the ex-ante effect, right? That Russia might have expected to be able to use this coercion. In fact, might still be able to use it next winter. And so therefore, Russia maybe fostered European energy policy. I'm conscious of the time, so I will not go too much further other than to say maybe this last one on the long term. Russia's status as a great power, I think, is very much at risk as a consequence of what they've done in terms of invading. And this is true almost independently of the outcome of the war, where Russia has lost Europe as its major energy consumer, barring a kind of really remarkable change of heart by European policymakers, which I think is implausible for the foreseeable future. Europe is not going to want to buy Russian energy, at least not be dependent upon them. And that's a real problem, because when you look at a map of Russia's pipelines, they all go towards Europe. And there's something like one pipeline from Siberia into Asia. And so they don't have infrastructure to easily pivot their energy resources to new consumers, particularly those in Asia. And that paints like a pretty bleak economic future for Russia's situation. And I think that actually makes it potentially harder to find an off-ramp for the war. If Putin himself is sort of seeing some pretty negative outcomes that he will have to explain to his domestic constituency, that makes it potentially even tougher to find. I think there are some policy consequences to this. So let me explain them really quickly, and then my next slide flat. Energy security is a long-term investment, consistent with what I was talking about before in terms of oil for security arrangements, with very durable, long-term combinations. And European leaders have, to a certain extent, underinvested in energy security. They've underestimated the security externalities, if you wish, of the the energy decisions that they make. And I think many of them, especially in Germany, are now living with some regret about those decisions. But ironically, the decisions they're making right now, current European energy and tax policy decisions, risk repeating that exact same mistake. And in fact, what they're doing is placing windfall taxes on the electricity generating sector, including wind and solar, the renewable sector. And they're using that windfall revenue to subsidize natural gas, and in essence, to lower the price for residents and for industry. And we understand the domestic politics and incentives for doing this. But if we think about the sort of signals the government is sending to the market, this is exactly the opposite of what we would want, certainly from an environmental perspective, where we are, subsidizing fossil fuels, but also from a security perspective. They are missing an opportunity to move to an energy system that depends on wind and sunshine as the fuel, as opposed to potentially risky foreign supply. Right? So there is this kind of security dimension to this that I don't think has been sort of fully appreciated in European energy. So to recap, subsystems, I think, are a useful way of thinking about international order, and they operate in this kind of quasi-independent. Sometimes they're quite independent of each other, such that we can get remarkable change in some subsystems, like both the IPE system for oil, but have remarkable degree of continuity in the security. And the Ukraine war makes that independence much more semi-independent than in fact it's bringing the oil and gas supply back into the fold, if you will, of the other. And we still need ultimately a theory about how changes in one subsystem. And this event, I think, should sort of stimulate some thinking on that. But at the moment, the argument in the paper is very much a descriptive inference kind of one, and we await a deeper causal theory about how these reverberations occur across different subsystems, not just for oil, but for any topic. Thanks so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you a lot. I neglected to say at the start that we're doing this jointly, happy to be strong with the Center for International Security Studies here. The aforementioned John Ikenberry. Who wants to lead us off? Oh.
Yeah, very interesting talk. I guess I was kind of wondering whether it's really sort of the case that these subsystems have been independent. So you've got an oil embargo in the 70s, right? And we know at that point that things are security and oil are interrelated, right? And you get then the Russians messing with like Ukraine in the elections back in 2010 with shutting off the oil to affect them there. You then got the sort of the US fracking revolution, which you didn't really mention. And in that case, everybody in the US or in the government is talking about US energy independence now, relating it to security issues as well as economic issues. And then you've got the Americans and others, like the French, being very worried about Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, all through the 2000s and the 2010s, about the security implications and the dependence that was being built by this. So I guess it just seems to me when you look at that pattern from 73 on, it's not clear to me that policymakers at least ever thought that those two things were linked from one another.
Great. So thank you for the question. I will put back on some of those things. I think you're right about a certain amount of rhetorical linking. There's always been a discussion around energy independence, and that goes back way before McCain all the way. McCain talked about energy independence and drill baby drill in his campaign, but this goes back all the way to Nixon. Right? Every president is different. Almost, American energy independence and prized it. And it has always been a real frustration even to those who are doing energy policy inside the government. Both Democrats and Republicans, you have people from the National Security Council say, do not say energy independence, and don't think about these as being sort of two subsystems where we can have real leverage, especially with regard to asking the Saudis or others to change their energy policy to affect prices. It's not like the US military gives us some leverage on that. These are independent subsystems. And so even with, say, for instance, in 74 or 73, with the oil embargo, there was a conversation. In fact, the Congressional Research Service did a study about whether the US should just invade and take over the Saudi oil fields. There really was this conversation. And people sort of quickly realized, look, this is like not going to work. And the kind of leverage, the kind of power that the US has doesn't give us the ability, as we found out, 40 years later, to just go in and impose whatever kind of governance we want locally. So I think there has been more separation between the two, and in particular, if you think about the Seven Sisters cartel as being a way in which the US and to a certain extent the British had some real effect over the prices of oil and the IPE of oil, they really lost it in the 70s, right? In the sense that nationalization did break up the cartel. And so this was something that, made Henry Kissinger and others furious. They really had lost control of that. So there was this higher degree of separation than we certainly saw in the previous. So that's how I would read the material, even though you're not wrong that there's always been there's been concerns about this, and especially your point about the French and the US being very concerned with World Order 1 and 2, saying, look, there are real security implications to this. And yet they were built anyway. Right? The behavior was, well, the Europeans decided to think about their markets as being kind of separate from great power politics. And then discovering that that was no longer true.
Can I just two-finger on that? Yeah. Aren't we kind of conflating two things? It's one thing to say that the two are intrinsically not connected, but it's not that the Congress can, commission a study to figure out whether this is feasible. Just they are connected in theory. That's different than saying they're connected, but we just don't have the clout to prevent it. And so why aren't we just back to HST the way we always understood it? The U.S. for one reason or another, we could discuss that, didn't feel it had the military power or the market power to prevail in 1973, so we put up with an enormous increase in oil prices. Yes, we supplied oil, but at a high cost. I remember that well as being an undergraduate who had to stand in line at 4 o'clock in the morning to get gas every other day in California. And now we're up against Russia, where it appears, given the balance of resolve, that we have sufficient military power to hold them. And we, as you pointed out, have some economic power to squeeze them. So why aren't we just back to good old HST?
Yeah, I think, I think there's just too much slippage in terms of the degree to which the US has military power and is able to translate that power into a very different subsystem. Right? Where the question is about how much oil to produce and where to produce it, the US substantially doesn't have a lot of leverage on that question for quite a long time, and has to live with that conflict. Right? I think for a period where things, as Helen pointed out, the fracking revolution gives it more leverage about how much oil to produce in the US. But that doesn't actually translate to, oh yeah, now we can control prices. You can't do that. And we couldn't, no matter how much we were importing or exporting, we were still sort of linked to markets. The way that it's changing now with Ukraine is that we are saying, okay, we're going to use all of the tools available in terms of insurance markets and shipping markets, and we're going to get the British on board, and so most of those are based in London, in a way that we just wouldn't have been able to organize absent the Ukraine. So that's I think shifting why those subsystems are back.
Harold?
So this is a version actually of the same question. I mean, I think they're all pointing in the same direction. But I find it a bit difficult to see how your fields of energy and finance and trade are really separate from each other, in that you're trading energy and you have to pay for it. And a concrete illustration of that is actually the one that you just raised in the middle of the 1970s. So at the first of the big summits, it's G6 actually in RWO in 1975. And when exactly this discussion occurs about whether you should use military means to intervene in the Middle East, Henry Kissinger says, don't use military means. We've got a better way of doing it. If you encourage the oil producers to put their big deposits in the Western banking system, we will have a leverage over them. And the finance actually becomes the leverage, and they're really as connected then as they are now. So I think it's really difficult separating the trade from the financing. You just mentioned the insurance and the physical capacity to produce the energy.
Yeah. So thank you. And you're right. Kissinger has lots of things to say about oil, many of them long-headed, but she comes around. At first, he's all about we have to smash them. We're going to create the IEA to be a buyer's cartel. We're going to wreck OPEC. And he fundamentally doesn't get the economics of oil until he sort of learns it. In terms of later, he's brought into this idea of petrodollar recycling, which is the Secretary of Treasury who's really orchestrating that and makes that happen over the next couple of years from 74 to 76. But your broader question is, look, isn't oil connected to trade and finance? And of course it is, right? The world is too complicated and too enmeshed to say, look, these are completely different spheres. It's just that I think I would come back to the notion, this relates to Andy's question as well, if you have at the core, you have some, right, a fundamental functional question about how much oil to produce, right? This is distinct from who has sovereignty over the oil. The way that we answer those questions are met with and addressed by different actors with different capabilities, different bargaining leverage. And that's why analytically, I think it's quite useful to think about them as totally distinct questions analytically, even then empirically they interrelate. And so I'll leave it there.
Ethan, we'll come back to this relationship between economics and security from a different angle, or energy and security. Gerhard Schroeder, now very vilified, of course, made the point in the New York Times interview not long ago. Look, when I became head of Gazprom, the chairman of Gazprom International, we believed in interdependence theory. Can you speak to that? Interdependence theory also joins security with energy markets, with the economy more broadly. And the idea is that Europe and Russia would be so mutually dependent on one another that the cost of breaking that relationship would be simply too high. That was a theory that I think was quite pervasive in Europe at the time. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so in a way, he's making my case for me, right? That there was this thought that these two were sufficiently strongly linked to each other that you couldn't break them. But he was wrong, right? That in fact, Germans buying Russian gas did not link Russia sufficiently tightly to the idea of a European peace, and that he was wrong to think that Europe was, or that Russia would then be framed by that idea. Now, maybe he had good reasons to think that, but there were, at the Talon point, there were lots of others saying it's not that strong. Right? Interdependence theory is not that powerful to bind Russia and to bind somebody who was, fairly determined to break. So I think again, there's this question about, okay, so who provides the gas, and that is distinct from what are the gas. It's a little bit tricky, right? But who owns the gas, or who has sovereignty over the oil? And And that's not really at stake in this Russia-Ukraine conflict, because it's not really plausible that Russia is invading Ukraine to seize some gas fields. There actually are some gas fields in Donbass, et cetera, but that's not really, I think, the core of the argument. The core, in terms of like who owns Russia's gas fields, no one expects that to change. And so I do think that the question about who owns the underlying asset and the security arrangements that protect those are different from how much to provide, right? How much to supply.
Sure. Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. The book is also fantastic, so I encourage everyone to read it in full. I guess I'm going on the same tenet that all the other and I wanted to sort of take the German perspective. So German policymakers and politicians before 2020, they would say that the Americans are always insisting that your energy is all about security. That's why you shouldn't build Nord Stream. And they were very heavy-handed about it for many years. And the Germans would always say, no, this is about our chemical industry. Boss F wants this pipeline. We need cheap natural gas. We are a country without cheap natural gas. We can't be that way. And the German government was organized as such. Right? They don't have a national security council. They have an energy ministry that's usually not held by the same office as the prime minister, and those discussions get separated. So my question is, sort of, if that's true, what does that say about orders? Is it, by this story, like the Americans were always playing the joint game, that these orders are strongly linked, whereas perhaps others, maybe more subordinate states, were playing like a differential game? Is that one way to interpret it? Yeah, another way to interpret it is just the way many of my security friends do it, which is that this brings economic issues, and interdependence theory is all wrong. And you're all wrong worrying about all this IPE stuff. It's just fundamentally all about security.
Yeah, so, thank you for your question. And I think sort of having that perspective on where the Germans were coming from is worthwhile. It's worth saying that the Americans have been pounding this message of like, look, security concerns, and the Germans were understandably skeptical, because when you scratch the surface about what America was saying, you should not build this thing from Russia. And oh, by the way, we have some liquid natural gas exports that we'd like to sell you, right? So there was this like naked American economic commercial interest that undercut the argument that the US was trying to make, was that there was a security concern there. But as it turns out, just because the Americans had a naked commercial interest in it, they weren't wrong, right? That there was something true there, that there was a security risk. I think, on that question of how much these are overlapping, the point I'm trying to make is that the degree to which they are separate and they actually are governed separately is variable over time, right? That is not fixed. And I think somebody mentioned earlier, like, well, are these like inherently distinct questions? The point is that they're not permanently fixed as such and can never come back together. That in fact politics can push subsystems in different ways and jostle them around. So I think that's what we're seeing right now is subsystems being reintegrated. But imagine trying to explain this whole story just with our old ideas about issue areas, where we just treat it as like, oh yeah, there's a thing here. You could do that, but what you end up with is, a less rigorous analytical framework for trying to figure out, well, what part is changing and what part isn't changing, because you've just got, an amorphous blob. And so trying to pull that apart with subsystems, I think is more helpful.
Anybody else? Okay, before we thank Jeff, let me announce next week's speaker is Yateng Wang from MIT Sloan. It's got a great title, but you have to listen carefully to get The Rise and Fall of the East, all capitals, capital E-A-S-T, Examination, Authority, Stability, and Technology in Chinese History and today. Thanks a lot for really